Welcome, everyone, to this week's Taproom Live. It's been a few weeks since we've last spoken to you, but we have a fun segment here coming back. This one is actually called the Style Guide. I think we should call it Between Two Maxes. I'm Max Nevins. I run marketing over at 6 Point, and I am joined by Max Finnance. He's the real star of this show. He is the Advanced Cicerone. He heads up education at 6 Point, and actually for all of the brands at Artisanal Beverage Ventures, including Victory, Southern Tier, and Bold Rock, who all make up this wonderful Taproom Live channel. And we are going to talk to you today about different sour styles of beer. So there's going to be several different styles that we explore within the sour descriptor or category. Max, do you want to just start off and talk a little bit about how sour is not a style and why that's so important to this session today?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start, Max. And I think that's a good place to start because people and beer consumers and beer retailers, and I've even heard people that work for breweries use the word sour to describe the style of the beer rather than to describe the attributes of the beer. And in reality, there's no such style as sour beers. Saying that you enjoy sour beers is sort of the same thing as saying you enjoy sweet beers or bitter beers. The sour is just one component of that. So you could say it's an umbrella, the same way that you describe hop-forward beers. But underneath that sour umbrella, there are tons of historic styles and modern styles and brand new and emerging styles, like one of the ones we'll try today, that have sour as a either slight or important part of the flavor profile. And I think it's important that we talk about those distinctions.
Great. And we have seen sour sort of meld itself into certain styles as a descriptor within those styles too. You see things like session sours and stuff like that. So I think it is a descriptor that people understand at the very least, and helps people make sense of certain styles. So we've got 4 beers here today that we're going to drink. There's a lot of alcohol in all 4 of these beers. We'll see if we make it through all 4 of them in this brief session with you. But each one of these beers represents a different type of sour, whether it's a process or per the style guidelines. So I'm just going to grab my 4 and I'll mention what all 4 are, and then Max, you tell us how we're going to drink these. So I've got a Citrus Jammer, a nice 6 Point classic here. I've got a Victory Sour Monkey. This one is the one that will really hurt. It's 9.5%. And I hear it has to go down quick. We've got Cosmic Handshake. So this one is a collaboration between 6 Point and Victory. So our brew teams got together and came up with this formulation, and our design team each drew half of the handshake there, or so the legend is told. And then I have here a Blackberry Raspy. I was going through my fridge to pull out a Wild Raspy, which is what Max is going to drink. And I found this nice can of 2-year-old beer, and I thought it's worth a risk to drink it on camera.
Yeah, and for those of you at home tuning in, if you've never seen Blackberry Raspy or if you've never seen Wild Raspy, that's totally understandable. Probably means you're not super close to Brooklyn. Those are both small batch releases that we did at our brewery within the last couple of years. And so Max and I have both dug into our cellars for those. I wanted to talk about Wild Raspy because it is a process that's quite divergent from the other 3. And then the Blackberry Raspy will be a nice vintage.
Honestly, it's like a science experiment. It was really, I just want to see what happens. I want to live on the wild side here without a wild beer. Emily Palmer is asking us who's going to make the first session sour lager. I don't know, Emily. We'll think about that one. Give us a few weeks.
There's all sorts of things in that sentence that make my brain want to explode, Emily. But I think you probably asked that question for that reason.
Yep. Good to hear from you, Emily. Thanks for joining us. All right. So, which one are we going to drink first?
So I have my beers, and I will say I opened all my beers and I poured all my beers before we got started. I wanted to let them warm up a little bit. But one thing that's important with sour beers, especially with a beer like Wild Raspy that's fermented in the bottle, is they can get a little bit lively and overcarbonated. So you always want to open those bottles when they're cold and then let them warm up to temperature. So you won't see me open anything on camera today, but I promise that's what I'm drinking.
You'll hear me and see me open it. I'll make up for it. Max is the sophisticated advanced one. I have the layman's palate. I'm here as a counterpoint.
So as far as the order goes, I have mine lined up with Citrus Jammer coming first, then the Wild Raspy, then the Sour Monkey, and finishing off with the Cosmic Handshake. But I think the most important part of that lineup is that the Citrus Jammer comes first. This is the most mellow out of the 4 beers. It's the lowest in alcohol. It's the lowest in bitterness. It's designed to be, an all-day, everyday type of beer. So it's a natural place to start.
Great. So Citrus Jammer is a Goza, and the Jammer family is modeled after traditional German Gozas, right? So there's a few different ways that people think about Gozas. There's the super sour Americanized Goza, and then there's the traditional German Goza. So why don't you talk about those, and then we'll talk a little bit about how this one then takes a hard turn away from that as well.
Yeah. So I think if I'm thinking back on some of the previous Taproom Lives we've done, I feel like we've mentioned this in the past. So if you tune in all the time and it sounds like I'm repeating myself, I might be. But Gozas are a really old German style, hundreds and hundreds of years old. And then they almost died in like the 1970s. There was basically no commercial examples being made. They were revitalized in Germany in the late 70s, early 80s, and then really came into their own in the American craft beer market through this reinvigoration within the last 10 to 15 years. So the original the original German examples, as best we all know, are pretty mellow, not super salty, not super sour. They're more refreshing. And there was some salt added to the water, but it was not designed to be super, super salty. Some of the first American examples, in the true spirit of American craft, really just ran with it and went super, super sour or super salty or super funky. And we'll talk about the difference between, sour versus funky in a little bit. But they were extreme examples of the style. And when 6 Point first launched Jammer, we really didn't want to go down that road. We wanted to make something that was closer to the traditional German roots. So the 6 Point Jammer is much less salty, much less sour, and definitely not funky compared to some of the other American beers that you'll see wearing that Goza label. And then Citrus Jammer
was oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say Citrus Jammer is a departure from the tradition altogether because we've added fruit to it. So the addition of the lime juice and the lemon juice to go along with that Goza characteristic, we think is a really nice addition, but it's not traditional.
Definitely. Yeah, Leipzig Goza was one of my formative beers. It was one of the beers that got me into craft beer as an import. So I immediately gravitated towards even the earliest iterations of Jammer, which weren't quite as imbalanced. Over 4 years, we've made a lot of tweaks to bring everything perfectly into balance. But like you said, that level of sourness was critical to how we formulated the Jammer line to ensure that it was repeatable, to ensure that it was super refreshing. We didn't want it to be a one and done, too acidic, where sometimes after a few of those you don't feel great. We want it to be something you can drink all day. And so the original Jammer pH was about a 3.7, and then the citrus one that we're drinking now is a 3.3, so about 4 times more sour, but still really, really sessionable and really repeatable.
Yeah, cheers. And if you guys are tuning in from home, let us know what you guys are drinking at home too, especially if it's a sour.
Seems like it's a margarita in a can.
Yeah, I think with the Citrus Jammer, once you add the citrus component, the lime in particular, it really does walk that line of being, like you said, a margarita in a can. It's, a tequila shot away from being an instant cocktail. Mike, I see you in the
Henry,
chat.
which Max? Which Max?
Mike works for a brewery up in Connecticut, so I know Mike. Thanks for tuning in, Mike.
So this the Citrus Jammer, you mentioned cocktails. So one of the great things about different sour styles of beer, especially this one, which is heavy in adjunct with lemon and lime juice, is that they mix really well with all sorts of spirits. There's a ton of cocktails that we actually have available that you can make using Citrus Jammer, either as a component, add some lively carbonation, add some flavoring, or even as a base. It goes well with tequila. It goes well with gin. I've heard other things added. My favorite cocktail is just drinking like, that much off the top and then mixing gin right into the can. I think it's wonderful on a hot day.
I feel like that much is a pretty bold pour, Max.
I wasn't saying you fill that much gin back in there. It's just a good ratio.
Yeah, I think as a general rule, any cocktail where you're going to use tequila or mezcal or gin, and then there's some sort of soda water component, if you replace the soda water with either the standard jammer or the citrus jammer or one of the other flavors of jammer, depending on your preference and where you want the cocktail to go, that can work out really nicely. And then you're boosting the alcohol of your cocktail a little bit too. So you got to watch out with that. Johnny Osborne in the chat too. Nice. Johnny used to brew for us at 6 Point, and he's brewing over at Talea now, also in Brooklyn. So thanks for tuning in, Johnny.
Almost certainly drinking a sour IPA right now too.
I would put money on it.
All right. So what's next?
So the next beer that I would go to is the Wild Raspy, and this is also, I guess, of the three remaining beers, the one that probably has the most traditional roots.
And I'm doing the risky move here, the blackberry raspy. So while you talk about that one, if my face looks funny, that's what's going on.
And this Wild Raspy has been in the bottle for a couple of years now too. So this is not a recent project. And there are, anytime you're aging beers, there are no guarantees involved. This is smelling pretty good though.
So that one was base Little Raspy. So that was a kettle soured Berliner Weiss. With raspberry puree, and then that one was put in barrels for a total of 16 months.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a perfect description of what we did with it. So we haven't really talked yet about like the processes for sour, but you just mentioned Kettle Sour, and that's the base methodology where it's sort of the simplest and the safest way for a lot of brewers to get a sour flavor component into their beers, other than just adding acid to a beer. Which sounds crazy, but there are brewers out there that do that. So we've started with a kettle soured beer here, the Little Raspy, which is sort of the original version of that blackberry raspy Max is drinking. And then we put it into barrels, and that brings on another component, which is really the spontaneous inoculation, spontaneous fermentation, wild side of the beer. And that's where we're introducing bacteria and yeast that we don't really have much control over to the beer. And so that's where we're amping up that funky flavor profile. When people say sour, they're generally talking about acid, and that can be described typically as a one-note flavor. So sometimes a pretty complex sourness, but it usually revolves around an acid. It could be a yogurty or a citric or citrus type of acid flavor. Whereas once you get into the wild, funky side of the spectrum, you're talking about things like, if it's coming from Brettanomyces, it could range from horse blanket to barnyard to pineapple or cherry, depending on the strain of Brettanomyces. And that's one of those wild yeasts that I mentioned. And so you can get a much more complex flavor profile from using a wild inoculation or a mixed fermentation, spontaneous fermentation, those sorts of things. So that's what the barrel does.
I bet you Johnny could tell us exactly which barrels this one aged in, because he was with us for most of those 16 months, I believe.
And this also has still quite a bit of really nice oak character to it too. That you can tell before you even take a sip, you can tell that there's going to be some oak tannins in there.
So stylistically, so you talk process-wise, and also talk to us about what you're getting on that beer. But stylistically, so we just had a Goza. Now this one is a wild aged Berliner Weiss, but talk about Goza versus Berliner Weiss.
So Goza and Berliner Weiss are actually fairly similar. Goza traditionally has a salt addition and a coriander addition, but they're both traditional German styles that have a sour component, and they're made with a lot of wheat. So there's some pretty good similarity there. The Berliner Weiss can tend to be a little bit funkier on that flavor profile. They're both soured with lactobacillus, but you can get some funk and a little bit of that sort of gym sock, a little bit of weirdness with a Berliner Weiss that would be atypical in a Goza. Of course, without the salt and without the coriander additions, it really allows the wheat and the lactic sourness to shine more in the Berliner Weiss. Johnny says that they were Cabernet barrels. So from our friends over at Red Hook Winery, also in Red Hook. So that makes sense. He also has a cocktail ratio for you guys if you're tuning in. Johnny has drank his fair share of tequila jammer cocktails, so take it from a pro. But so going back to this beer, sorry, Max, where was I? I got off track there with Johnny's comment.
Thanks, Johnny. You were talking about the difference between Berliner Weiss and Goza, and you were essentially saying you were talking about the salt and the coriander contribution versus some of the different flavor characteristics that you'd get in a Berliner Weiss.
Yeah, and I don't want to go down too far of a tangent here, but I think the German brewing scene gets a little bit of a bad rap for being very bound by tradition and bound by restriction, and specifically people like to throw out Reinheitsgebot, which is this historic German purity law that basically, when it was written, said you could only brew with malt and with hops and with yeast, with water rather, because they didn't even know about yeast at that point, and then it was modified later to include yeast as a potential brewing ingredient. But that, if you just look at the brewing history of Germany that way, then you forget about the fact that Germany wasn't actually a country as we know it until the 1870s. So for all of the time leading up to the 1870s, there was also all of this really interesting brewing going on in other parts of Europe that are now Germany. The region where Goza comes from being one of those, Berliner Weiss being another example of that. So a Berliner Weiss is a style that's traditional to Berlin, and a Goza is a style that's traditional to what was originally a really small town called Goslar, and then became more famous through the slightly larger city of Leipzig, which is home to the Leipziger Goza you mentioned, Max. So
I butchered the pronunciation, apparently, though. That's...
I might be butchering it too. I haven't been there yet, so I'm just doing my best after reading it out of a book and hearing people talk about it a couple times.
So tell us what you're getting on that specific beer. And how those wild characteristics then come through in the Berliner Weiss.
So for me, this one has, at this point especially, having been in the barrel for a year and a half and in the bottle for, my best guess would be 2 years in the bottle at this point. I think this one has departed pretty far from the Berliner Weiss original roots. I think this drinks more like, an American wild ale with some oak character and some fruit addition. The oak and the raspberry are really big and forefront for me. There's a tiny bit of acetic acid, which comes across as a little bit of a vinegar note, and that's sort of typical for aged beers that spent time in barrels especially. I think it's a really nice complexity in this. It's something you would find in a style like a Flanders Red, but, really enjoyable. There's no hop character to this beer. The malt character to a Berliner Weiss would be typically along those wheat and Pilsner malt lines, and that's very, very subdued here too. This is really showing off the barrel and the fruit. And those funky...
Take a guess. How do you think the Blackberry Raspy that's 2 years old held up? What do you think? So just for everyone, it was canned on May 17th of 2018.
And the most important question is, has it been in your fridge the whole time?
With the exception of one move, yeah, it's been in the fridge the whole time.
I bet it's drinking pretty good. I drank.
It's incredible.
I drank a can of Little Raspy not too long ago that was also over a year old, and that was drinking great too. So it
honestly
really
tastes excellent. It doesn't have any signs of age, and it's not like it's gotten overly sour. It's still a really nice level of tartness that mellows out as I'm drinking it. And just a ton of fruit. I mean, you can see the color. There was a lot of fruit in this one.
Yeah, and from my memory, that looks an awful lot like it did when we were drinking it 2 years ago. So that's a great sign, and a testament to the quality of the the packaging and what the brewers are doing down in Red Hook, because that's, for a beer like that to hold up for 2 years. Of course, we've talked about before, the most important thing when you're storing beers is temperature, right? So the colder you keep them, the slower they're going to age or spoil. So the fact that you've had it in your fridge for 2 years, we're doing good.
And
Oh, Janine living in the Virgin Islands. Yes, that's I would imagine. I've never been to the Virgin Islands, but I imagine that's a whole different beer scene down there too.
So Citrus Jammer and Blackberry Raspy are the same pH, 3.3, but Blackberry Raspy, just in terms of the balance of the fruit, taste or is the perception of it is much more sour to me, despite the same pH there. That's just one observation between those.
So I'm hesitant to even go open this door and go down this rabbit hole, but I will just to sort of answer. And I don't want. I'm hesitant to do it because I don't have an answer to the question it's gonna bring up. But there's actually a better system for talking about how sour something's going to be perceived than pH, and that would be if we were talking about titratable acidity or total acidity in the beer. And so pH, like you said, pH is sort of a one-note descriptor. A beer that's pH with citric acid will taste very different than the same pH if it's lactic acid. Whereas if you look at your TA value, that adjusts for the sources of the acidity. So
that'll be the advanced Taproom live. We'll do that on the advanced session.
Yeah, and like I said, I didn't really want to open that door because I don't know what the TA for these two beers is. But the fact that the blackberry is coming off as more acidic would lead me to believe that there's a pretty big difference in the TA for those two beers. So.
Johnny, you still there? You remember the titratable acidity? All right, let's move on to the next one. What do we have up next?
And I will say, for you guys that are tuning in at home, there's a lot of beers we're trying to talk about today. You know, we don't have all the time in the world. So if I just mention a concept that you guys are more interested in, A, feel free to drop questions in the chat. But also, B, this is a book that I have on my shelf behind me all the time. I like it a lot. It's called American Sour Beers. And one of the tenets of this book is that the author sort of profiles how 30 different breweries in America make sour beer. And the gist of it is that all 30 of them make sour beer in a very different way. And so there's no right way or wrong way. There's just a right way for you. So if you're a brewer, home brewer, professional brewer, and I say something and you're like, no, that's crazy, it's important to realize that very, very much of this is not right or wrong. It's just how we choose to do things.
Great. Saw some conveniently placed book.
Yeah, I took that off the shelf just before we started because I knew I would want to mention it. Nice.
Got Jonathan drinking a resin from the kegerator. That's a bold move at home. We appreciate you.
Dave
wants more Alpenflow in California. We might be able to help you out there. I'll make a call tomorrow. We'll send some Alpenflow your way.
All right. So you want to move on to the next beer, Max?
Yes. So we have just done two beers that are 4 to 4.5%. So if this starts going down crazy tangents, it's because Max is going to pick either 9.1 or 9.5% beer next, but we're going to finish both on camera. We'll not end the stream until they're done.
That's a bold call, Max. I'm not sure I'm on board with that, but we'll see, I guess. The next beer I think we should move to is the Victory. This is the Sour Monkey. This is a sour Belgian triple. It's from the Victory, the Monkey family of beers. You know, the Golden Monkey being the original, that Belgian triple, and then Sour Monkey being the sour offshoot. Cheers.
Cheers.
And this is another one, before we even really dive into it, that there's no such style as a sour triple. So what Victory's done here is take a traditional style of a Belgian triple and then add the sour component to it. And I think it's a really interesting, really fun beer. And, you know, beer drinkers love it.
Yeah, what's really interesting about this one to me, just first impressions, and this is not my first time having this one, but it's been a while, is the balance of acidity at the high ABV. The perceived acidity comes off much lower, just because it's balanced with other sweetness and booziness as well.
Oh, that's interesting, because I was going to say that I thought this was the most acidic of the three I've had so far. So it's entirely possible that my Wild Raspy was less sour than your Blackberry Raspy.
Yeah, 2 year old blackberry raspy.
But yeah, I mean, this is a really well balanced beer. You definitely get that sourness, and it's nicely, like you said, it is nicely balanced by that alcohol, though. There's no hiding 9.5%. Like, it smells a little bit boozy, and then it sort of comes up on the back palate for me. I think it gets a little bit of that alcoholic warmth, but
I get like a really nice sweetness on the aroma, but almost like a spiciness too, like a comforting spice.
mm,
So talk to us about this one, style and process.
So this is going to be process-wise, going to be much closer to the citrus jammer that we were talking about. Victory actually has a really fancy system for making their sours. It's not even like something you would read about in the American Sour Beers book, because theirs is totally different. But they have this pretty complex system for bioacid propagation, which basically means that they're always growing their own house lactobacillus culture and house lactic acid. That they can use to sour beers when they want to make a sour beer. And so they have this house culture going on that has migrated maybe away from where it started a little bit, but now it is truly theirs and truly unique. But it still maintains the safety benefits for a brewery of making a kettle sour where all of your souring happens before you boil the beer. And the benefit of that really is that there's less risk of microbiological contamination to the rest of your brewery because you're not putting things like Brettanomyces or lactobacillus into your downstream brewing components, where it might be harder to disinfect or harder to, a brewer would say CIP, like clean in place, for that equipment. So there's less QA QC concerns and worries when you make a beer with all the souring done before the boil. In this one though, I think it adds a really nice complexity, and it doesn't overwhelm, the base golden monkey. I think you still get a pretty good amount of that Belgian triple underneath. It still has a little bit of that funky Belgian yeast, a little bit of a banana note to it. It has, like you said, a little bit of a spice, which is pretty typical with a Belgian triple, and Belgian yeasts in general. And then it still has a little bit of that like citrus, and it finishes very, very dry. As you want a Belgian triple too. Belgian triples can be deceivingly sweet on the aromas and the flavors, and then they finish quite dry. And you still get that nice,
delightful beer. It's not puckering at all. I could see drinking a few of these and then not knowing where I am.
Yeah, and the malt doesn't disappear. Like, there's still a little bit of Pilsner malt in the background there. It's a nice beer, like you said, 9.5%. Being original 6 Point employee, we always used to talk about having resin stories, but I could quickly see getting some monkey stories too from one too many of these sneaky beers. Or if you find yourself with one of those mystical monkey packs, the mixer variety pack that Victory makes, where you get a couple of the golden monkey, a couple of the sour monkey, a couple of the twisted or the tart monkeys. That's a good value buy for a Friday night if you want some high alcohol stuff.
Although for a friend at home who has the resin on his home kegerator, I'm sure he's got some pretty good resin stories.
For sure.
So you talked to us about process. So just sour triple there. That's a fairly unique thing. That's not a standard style of beer. That's essentially taking a triple and then souring it. So talk to us a little bit about that stylistically, and then if you know where the inspiration came from for this one.
I will get the second question out of the way because it's a great question, but I don't know the answer. That's one where I wish we had Ron or Bill on with us to talk about the inspiration for Sour Monkey. But yeah, like going back to the first question, I think it's important for, styles are important, and they're important for consumers. Mostly, I think now they're important for consumers to understand what they're buying, and so they can have some sort of expectations for the product they're about to consume. If they pick a box off the shelf, it has to have some sort of hints on it as to whether or not they're going to like it. And style names are great for that. But styles aren't the be-all, end-all. At 6 Point, we've brewed a lot of beers over the years that don't fit into any style envelope particularly nicely. and lots of the best brewers, especially in America and with creativity being forefront right now, I think it's important to realize that like whether something fits in the style or whether something even is a style, isn't if it doesn't fit into one of those envelopes, then that's not necessarily a check in the against that beer. You can have a really fun, delicious, interesting beer that doesn't do well in competitions, even for that reason. Because when we judge competitions, we're talking about the guidelines as they're written and not just the overall hedonistic value of the beer.
Great, yeah. So it's good. I can see why it's so popular.
Totally. And that one segues really nicely into the last of the 4 beers that we have to talk about, which is this Cosmic Handshake.
So this one is a collaboration between 6 Point and Victory. So we took some of our New England IPA bases. There's some we've experimented at a small scale with our can releases on a lot of different sour IPAs as well. But when our brewers came together, Sour Monkey really was the other end of that inspiration of why we landed on Sour IPA. And we are actually working right now on doing the other half of this collaboration, so a complimentary beer to this that Victory will be releasing next year.
Yeah, and this is, I said this was a nice segue, not just because of the Victory component, but because of the stylistic component here too. Sour IPA is not really a style in the same way that Sour Triple is not really a style. We've taken 2 things that the consumer knows about, an IPA base, and added the sour to it the same way that originally they had added the sour component to the Belgian Triple base. It's funny that you picked that glass, Max. That's the same glass I'm drinking this one out of.
This is my Taproom Live glass.
So at its heart, this is a New England IPA, right? We loaded this one up. It's Idaho 7, Mosaic, and Citra hops. And those hops really come through. In my mind, personally, when you make a sour IPA, I think it's pretty critical that you have low bitterness, because bitterness and sourness just don't play nicely together on your palate. A traditional IPA, if we go back in time, even 10, 15 years, IPAs are quite bitter. So the idea of souring one of those beers doesn't work so well. When you add sourness to the New England IPA style, though, which is a much lower bitterness version of the IPA realm, I think that can work really nicely. And in this case, I think the sourness adds a really nice lemon zest character that, and a lemony citrus that works really well with some of that tropical fruity aromas and flavors from those 3, new American hops.
Great, yeah, and one of the other things we do when you talk about balance, so in addition to bitterness, we also try to balance the sour level too. And try to not make it puckering or too tart. It's something, this is a 16-ounce can. You want to be able to finish the whole thing and feel overwhelmed by that sour level either, or throw that, distort, the hop character you're getting with an undrinkable level of sourness. So I know you don't like pH, but this one is 3.3, just like Citrus Jammer and just like my Blackberry Raspy over here. So it's the same sour level, but the perceived sour level of all of them is really different. And this one, the perceived sour level, I think, is different because of the malt body. It's got a lot more alcohol in it. It's 9.1%. We haven't fallen out of our chairs yet. We're doing well. And also because it's balanced out by that hop character and the flavors that contributes.
Just to clarify, Max, it's not that I don't like pH. pH absolutely has a place.
pH.
pH is, for a lot of breweries, the standard that they talk in. pH is the system that most people can relate to, because everyone learns about pH in high school chemistry classes or even earlier. But I just wanted to illustrate that there are reasons why 3.3 doesn't always taste like 3.3 pH.
Okay, perfect. Well, yeah. Thank you, Max, for going through this. I want to turn to our producer here and see if we have any other. Our producer's Chris. He's in the background. He's been speaking our ears the whole time. Anytime we had an awkward pause, it's because he was telling us to say things, and half the time we didn't listen. I'm just going to see if he has any other questions from the audience. And I know that I promised on the internet that I'd be giving away 5 of these hop stress balls. I've been squeezing one the whole time. And we never really talked about how we're going to give them away. So I'm going to have Chris right now go to the comments and pick a few people. And then we will follow up with those people and send you guys some nice stress balls, because who doesn't need a stress ball right now? Chris, any other questions?
So we've got one question in the chat asking how sour Cosmic Handshake is. Don't normally like sour beers or do well with sour beers, but really like IPAs. I would say this is a moderately sour beer. It's, as Max was saying, the pH is fairly sour, but it doesn't really come across as super sour because of all the other things that are going on with that flavor profile. The 9% alcohol, that hoppiness, there's a lot of malt in the background there. Not caramel malt, but more of that wheat and Pilsner, and it's got that nice soft body that you would expect with a New England IPA. I would say give it a shot.
I also, to add to what Max is saying, I think that a sour IPA is a really good introductory sour, or sour for people who don't like sours, because of how it balances. But I would say that Citrus Jammer is another really good beer for people who don't like sour, because while it has a tart element, it's not always perceived as super sour, because a lot of that tartness comes from the lemon and lime juice, which a lot of people are more familiar with.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And then I see another question in there that says, what would you do with a food pairing for Sour Monkey? That's a great question. Food pairings on the spot are always a little bit tricky, but Max, what are you thinking? Do you have any ideas?
I was trying to rack my brain for where you were going to go with it. I was going to say potentially some seafood or some shellfish. We've seen go well with like the brininess of a jammer, but it does have a really different profile than that, and much higher alcohol. I mean, you gotta look to Belgian food a little bit, I guess, here too, because it is still a triple.
Yeah, so I'm torn actually on that. I sort of went the opposite direction as you. I was thinking starting with something bigger and richer, but after taking another sip, I think I'm going to go back to something seafood focused, maybe something like a fish tacos, where it's a little bit more involved and more intense. Because with a good food pairing, you always want to think about your intensity and match your intensity. And so if it would depend on how you do your fish tacos, this beer could totally blow them away and overwhelm them. Or if you do your fish tacos in a way that they have some pretty assertive flavor to them, they might be able to stand up to this pretty well. I was thinking something like a breaded whitefish with maybe a cabbage slaw and some chipotle mayo on top. I think the banana and fruity notes in the Sour Monkey could add almost like a pineapple chutney that might go really well on top of that fish taco without actually adding the pineapple chutney.
What an amazing reversal there. You went from probably not having an answer to the most specific answer down to the pineapple chutney. That was incredible.
That's what I'm here for. If you used aged hops and lambics, new aged hops, I'm not sure what you're trying to say with that question there. We haven't really talked about how lambics are brewed. I'll just, in a one sentence explanation for anyone who's tuning in at home. Lambic is another traditional Belgian style that's brewed with aged hops. The hops are aged so that basically the bitterness component falls away, and you're left with a little bit of a antibacterial, antimicrobial type of effect from the hops that helps the beer age more stably. But those hops are usually aged several years before you're brewing, so they're really not giving much of a hoppy component, if any, to the beer. So I see Aaron Stein there commenting, calling Max and I nerds. That's an accurate assessment. Doesn't sound like Aaron though, so I feel like that might be her fiance Kier on her account. Just a hunch I have.
Okay, I think this is enough puree. I have a video of Kier, who's probably writing from her account, putting the puree into this beer, and he was completely covered from head to toe in red puree raspberries.
Could you boil shrimp in it? That's a great question. I don't think I would boil shrimp in the Sour Monkey. The thing that I would be concerned about there wouldn't necessarily be the hop bite. It would be the alcohol. I've never used a 9% alcohol beer as like a boiling base, so it's possible it could work really well, but I wouldn't want to commit to that without trying it. I think if you wanted to use one of these beers as a cooking liquid for shrimp, I would steer back towards the citrus jammer.
Or the original jammer.
Or the original jammer.
All right.
Looks
Thank
like
you all.
That, sorry, Max. I was just going to say, it looks like that's the questions we have.
Yep.
We will give away a couple of these stress balls in the chat here.
Chris, have you picked people?
Yeah, Chris, give us some winners.
Yep. He's really stressed right now. He's in our ear. He's so stressed.
All right, Barn Out Back. There's one. Dave Snyder. There's two. Jonathan AP. Aaron.
/Kier.
And Janine. That's five.
It's five. So to claim your stress ball of those 5 people, email info@sixpoint.com, and it will be Max at the other end to receive your email. And he and I will just verify that you're real.
And I guess we're going to give a 6th one to Mike Henry too. So thanks for tuning in, Mike.
Yep. Well, we'll verify that it's you when you email, and then we'll get you a stress ball mailed out, which everyone needs right now. They are excellent.
It's a good time for stress balls. That was in our marketing plan for the year before we even knew how crazy 2020 was going to get. So kudos to Max and the rest of his team for thinking a stress ball might be some fun merchandise. But yeah, thank you guys for tuning in again. Thank you for watching. As always, thank you for the good questions and for drinking along with us at home. You have anything else you want to say, Max?
Yep. So next week there will be another episode of Taproom Live. I don't have the information just yet to tell you exactly what the topic is or which of us will be bringing it to you, but check the Facebook group and we will post some details. Yep. And you can also check out some of the old ones in the wall if you've missed them. We had a really fun one recently where we interviewed Josh Bernstein about his new book, Drink Better Beer. And there have been some other fun ones as well. I believe that there was one with Chef Drew making wings with the monkeys. So check that one out too.
Absolutely. Thanks again to Chris behind the scenes, and thank you guys.